Under the relentless Arizona sun, Bryce and Avery Weston stood side by side on a patch of rugged land just east of an abandoned desert trail, staring at what would soon become their sanctuary. There was nothing glamorous about it, no manicured lawn, no neighborly greetings, and certainly no glossy welcome signs promising curated suburban life. The property was dry, raw, and unapologetically wild, but that was precisely what drew them in. After years of rigid living in over-regulated communities where every blade of grass was scrutinized by someone with a clipboard and an inflated sense of purpose, they wanted land where no one dictated the height of their fence or the color of their garage door. What they found instead was an aged, forgotten well, its rusted pump sticking out of cracked concrete like the last remnant of something valuable long dismissed. And that changed everything. The well was the first thing they inspected, even before the crumbling cabin or the fading solar panels still clinging to life on the roof. Bryce, practical to a fault, didn't see just a hole in the ground. He saw self-sufficiency. Water, especially in a state like Arizona, wasn't just a convenience. It was leverage, freedom, and survival. Avery saw something else too, the opportunity to build something enduring. A life shaped by their own hands. She was tired of living in a world where independence was mistaken for non-compliance. They would start here, with this land, this well, and reclaim that autonomy inch by inch. It wasn't easy. The pump didn't work, and the shaft hadn't been inspected in years. Bryce, who had grown up helping his grandfather on a cattle ranch in northern New Mexico, knew enough about water systems to be cautious. But after they brought in a local hydrologist, one of the few professionals they were willing to trust, they learned something unexpected. Not only was the water table healthy, but the well was drawing from a deeply rooted aquifer, one that had remained remarkably clean despite decades of neglect. It wasn't contaminated, wasn't drying up, and wasn't shared with any municipal lines. In fact, according to the reports, the well hadn't been tapped by anyone in at least 20 years. That made it, by every legal and technical standard, theirs. With permits secured and documentation filed through the proper, if tedious, channels, the Westons set to work restoring the system. They didn't have the money to hire a full crew, so Bryce handled the manual labor, digging trenches for pipes by hand, installing pressure regulators, and retrofitting the old motor with a solar-powered backup system. Avery took care of logistics, research, phone calls, supply runs, and maintaining the growing web of documentation that seemed to double every time they submitted something to the county. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. By the time they turned the faucet and watched the first clear stream of the cold water arc into the air, Avery cried, not from sentimentality, but from vindication. They had done it right, and no one could take it from them. The land came to life slowly, like an old animal stretching out after a long sleep. A few small planters went in first, herbs and hardy vegetables that could withstand the heat. They fixed the roof of the cabin room by room, reinforcing the structure while salvaging original wood where they could. They fenced off a small corner for goats and started building a hen house from leftover shipping pallets. Everything they did was careful, planned, and within the limits of the law. And although they weren't social people, they did what was necessary to stay on good terms with the handful of residents scattered across the sparse terrain. An older couple with bees, a semi-retired welder, and a single woman named Maria who worked from home and barely left her trailer. The interactions were cordial but minimal, and no one seemed particularly interested in small talk or town gossip. It suited the Westons just fine. They had been living there for just over 7 months when they first noticed the white golf cart. It rolled slowly down the dirt access road one morning, silent except for the occasional crunch of gravel. At first, Bryce assumed it was a delivery driver who had taken a wrong turn. Amazon drivers had a habit of pinging random GPS routes out there, but the cart didn't carry packages. It carried a man. He was wearing a collared khaki shirt with a stitched badge on the pocket and dark sunglasses that covered half his face. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stopped outside their gate and sat there, looking. When Bryce stepped out of the barn and approached, the man turned the cart around and left without a word. It was odd, but not alarming. In this part of the country, people valued their privacy. Sometimes they just watched. Then came the orange notice flag. It was taped to their water regulator one morning like a parking ticket. It wasn't from the county, nor from the utilities department, but from something called the Desert Ridge Community Oversight Committee. The name meant nothing to Bryce or Avery, but the bold, all-caps warning said everything it needed to. Unauthorized well operation subject to review and penalty under Article 14F. At the bottom, there was a phone number and, in red ink, a handwritten note. This is your only warning. Avery's gut tightened. She had checked the water rights thoroughly. The well wasn't registered to any cooperative water board, wasn't inside the limits of a gated neighborhood, and they weren't part of any homeowners alliance. The property had been listed as unincorporated private land, a detail they had confirmed 3 separate times before closing the deal. They weren't breaking any laws, but this note didn't feel like a citation. It felt like a threat. They called the number. No answer. They called again the next day, and the day after that. When someone finally picked up, it was a man with a heavy drawl who introduced himself as Daniel Capps, field supervisor for compliance and community integrity under the Desert Ridge Oversight umbrella. He spoke with the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. We've had several complaints from adjacent parcels regarding groundwater redistribution, he said flatly, as if reading from a script. Your well's not part of the approved supply grid. You'll need to shut it down pending assessment. Avery asked what assessment he was referring to and what regulation justified such an action. Capps didn't waver. Article 14F, Safety Provision. You should have received the documents by mail. If not, I suggest you check with the post office. We've never heard of Desert Ridge Oversight, she said. Our property isn't part of any community covenant. Capps chuckled. Everything within Sector 3 falls under regional purview. That includes your lot. Look, I'm trying to give you the courtesy of a heads up here. If we have to escalate this formally, it won't be nearly as friendly. The call ended with no resolution. No documents ever arrived in the mail, and when Bryce went to the county clerk to ask about Sector 3, or Desert Ridge's legal authority, no one could point to anything. There were mentions of pending proposals for new development zones, but nothing had passed. No annexations, no regional adjustments, no record of oversight boundaries changing in the last 2 years. A week later, a second flag appeared. This time, it was nailed directly into the wooden casing of the well cap. Same warning, same handwriting, but this time the ink was smeared. Perhaps from water, perhaps from something else. That afternoon, their goats refused to drink. Bryce checked the tanks and found the water tinged with an oily sheen. The pressure gauge was fluctuating. Something was wrong, and it wasn't natural. The only logical explanation was sabotage. That night, Bryce sat on the porch with a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, his eyes scanning the road. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. There was a difference. People like Capps didn't send warning shots for no reason. They tested boundaries, and when boundaries didn't hold, they pushed. He didn't know what was coming, but he was sure of one thing. Whatever it was, it would try to come for the water, and that meant it was already personal. It began early one morning when the sound of gravel crunching under unfamiliar tires cut through the silence like a warning. Avery was inside making coffee, the slow drip of the percolator the only other sound in the house, while Bryce stood outside by the shed checking the generator. He heard it first. Too heavy to be the usual delivery van, too deliberate to be a lost traveler. When he looked up, his jaw tensed. The white golf cart was back, and this time it wasn't alone. Behind it came a second vehicle, a dark green pickup truck with magnetic signs on the door reading Desert Ridge Community Oversight Patrol, the kind of signage designed to look official without holding any actual authority. Bryce wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward the gate. The man in the golf cart was Daniel Capps. He climbed out with the stiffness of someone who expected deference, adjusted his sunglasses, and offered a curt nod that carried no warmth. The driver of the truck remained inside, engine running as if waiting for a signal. Capps didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We're here to shut it down," he said, pointing with his chin toward the well pump. "Your system's been flagged as non-compliant." Bryce crossed his arms. "Flagged by who?" "Regional Standards Board, Article 14F, Section on Water Asset Control. Your permit is outdated." "That's not possible," Avery said, having stepped out of the cabin just in time to hear the exchange. "The permit was issued 9 months ago and confirmed in writing. There's no expiration clause unless we modify the infrastructure." Capps pulled out a clipboard. It wasn't a real inspection report. Bryce had seen enough of those over the years to know the difference, but it was dressed up to look like one. Neat checkboxes, a column for observations, and a few handwritten notes scrawled in red. He held it like a weapon, not a reference. "Your water output levels suggest redistribution into protected zones. That puts you under temporary suspension until we assess the risk." Avery stared at him. "There's no redistribution. It's a sealed line system with overflow routed to a buried reservoir. We're not dumping anything, and we're not connected to anything outside our property." Capps didn't argue. He didn't even seem to be listening. He turned and waved at the truck, and the driver began stepping out, pulling on work gloves as he approached the gate. That was the moment Bryce realized they weren't bluffing. They weren't there to inspect or warn. They were there to act. Bryce stepped forward, blocking the gate with his body. "You're not touching a damn thing until I see a court order or a sheriff." Capps tilted his head slightly, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips like a man who enjoyed provoking. "Sheriff's aware. This falls under civil enforcement, not criminal jurisdiction." "And yet," Bryce said, his voice low and steady, "you're on my land, without permission, about to disable essential infrastructure." Avery had already pulled out her phone and started recording, not for social media, but to document everything in case they ended up in court. She wasn't naive enough to think it would stop them, but it made them hesitate. Just enough. Capps took a step back, turned to the truck, and gave a short motion with his hand. The man stopped mid-stride. "We'll be back," Capps said. "You've got 48 hours to voluntarily disable the well and submit a deactivation form to our office. After that, we take further measures." He left without another word, climbing into the golf cart and turning back onto the dirt road, the truck following behind like a shadow. They didn't look back. Bryce and Avery stood in silence for a moment after the vehicles disappeared, letting the weight of the encounter settle. They had faced pressure before: bureaucracy, minor threats, suspicion from small-town officials. But this was different. This was coordinated. This was personal. And they had just been issued an ultimatum on the basis of a policy that didn't exist on paper. They spent the rest of the day contacting every regulatory office they could find. Water rights, county utilities, zoning, even the Department of Environmental Quality. None of them had heard of any pending review for their property. None had authorized any inspection or issued any notice. Avery left voicemails, sent emails, and sat on hold for hours trying to speak to someone who could explain what authority this Desert Ridge oversight actually had. No one could. The name wasn't even registered as a government entity. It was listed as a private advisory firm with no enforcement power. The more she looked, the more it resembled a shell operation masquerading as a public body. That night, Bryce installed a second lock on the pump access hatch and resecured the panel to the power inverter. He wasn't interested in theatrics or confrontation. He was interested in protection. The next morning, they found another notice. This one was laminated and zip-tied to the gate itself. It was more aggressive than the last, accusing them of deliberate non-compliance and warning of escalating penalties, including forfeiture of unauthorized resource infrastructure. The language was intentionally vague, but threatening. At the bottom, instead of a printed signature, there was a stamped emblem with the words Desert Ridge Committee Enforcement in a circular border. It looked official, but it wasn't. There was no such agency listed anywhere in public records. Avery drove into town to meet with a property attorney, one recommended by a friend who had dealt with boundary disputes. She brought the permit, the inspection reports, the deed, and a printout of every communication they'd received. The lawyer, a lean man in his late 40s named Stinson, looked through the documents with a growing frown. "This isn't regulatory language," he said, pointing to the latest notice. "This is designed to scare. Whoever wrote this is trying to manufacture authority where there is none, but that doesn't mean they won't act like it's real. I've seen it before, usually tied to development syndicates trying to apply pressure to outliers." Avery blinked. "You mean developers?" "Not exactly. Think of it more like an ecosystem. There's always someone buying land, someone coordinating compliance, and someone willing to apply pressure to get a parcel off the map or into escrow. That well? It's a liability to anyone trying to centralize water rights." Bryce clenched his fists. "So they fake oversight, hope we cave, and then move in once we're destabilized." Stinson nodded. "Or they provoke a reaction, then sue you for damages or interference. Either way, you lose time and money." He recommended filing a formal cease and desist letter through the county recorder's office and copying every relevant department with a notarized copy. It wouldn't stop them entirely, but it would create a legal trail that could later be used in their defense. Avery followed through the same day. Bryce, meanwhile, drove to the hardware store and purchased reinforced steel cabling to anchor the well access cover and surveillance signs to discourage trespassing. But pressure doesn't always come in the form of official notices. Sometimes it arrives at dusk, in silence, wearing boots that leave no footprints. 2 days after the legal filings, Bryce noticed something off. The overflow pipe, which drained into their buried reservoir, had been detached. The soil nearby was disturbed, as if someone had tried to redirect the outflow. The cable securing the access hatch showed fresh scrapes. Someone had been there. No alarms had been tripped. Whoever it was, they knew where to step. They reinforced everything again, changed the locks, set new perimeter lights. But a sense of inevitability crept in. Not because they were afraid, but because they could feel the momentum building. The conflict had entered a new phase. It was no longer about permits or compliance. It was about control. And they were being targeted not for what they had done, but for what they represented. That night, as they sat in the darkened living room, looking out over the vast stretch of the quiet desert, Bryce turned to Avery and said something he hadn't voiced aloud since this all began. "They're not trying to win, legally," he said. "They're trying to wear us down until we give up." Avery didn't reply immediately. She was staring at the reflection of the water tank through the window, its surface still and dark under the moonlight. "Then we don't break," she said finally. "We outlast." The morning the water ran dry, Bryce knew it wasn't just a malfunction. It had rained lightly the night before, enough to settle the dust and trickle into the dry beds along the hills, and when he stepped outside to check the pressure gauge, he could feel the air had shifted, heavier, stiller, as if something in the land itself was holding its breath. He flicked the switch on the pump housing and waited, listening for the familiar mechanical hum. Nothing. The gauge needle didn't even twitch. Avery came out moments later, tying her hair back, concern already etched into her face. Bryce didn't panic. He checked the fuse box, reset the pressure valve, even swapped out the solar inverter for the backup battery just to rule out an electrical issue, but nothing changed. The system was dead. When he pulled off the casing around the primary conduit line, what he saw stopped him cold. The copper tubing was warped, bent inward unnaturally, as though it had been clamped shut with industrial force. There were fresh scrape marks on the metal, not made by any tools he'd used. Someone had come during the night and physically sabotaged the pipe. Avery crouched next to him in silence, her eyes scanning the ground, noting the disturbed earth near the shed. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to go and what to target. They spent the rest of the morning documenting everything: photos, time-stamped notes, inventory of damaged parts. Avery called Stinson, their attorney, and left a detailed voicemail. Then they drove into town to find a replacement section of tubing, only to discover that the supplier they normally used had been restructured under new ownership and no longer carried well-specific infrastructure parts without a permit issued from the Regional Compliance Office, an office they had already determined didn't legally exist. Bryce didn't say a word on the drive back. He didn't have to. They were being boxed in, systematically, by a force that wasn't playing fair and didn't have to obey the rules because it had never intended to. That evening, they pulled water manually from the reserve tank and rationed it for cooking and cleaning. It wasn't sustainable, but it bought them time. Bryce spent hours in the shed, cutting and reshaping salvaged pipe pieces with a handheld torch, trying to rig a temporary bypass that could restart the system. By midnight, he had something that might hold. He and Avery reconnected the line, primed the pump, and for a brief moment, the familiar hiss of flowing water returned. It wasn't full pressure, but it was working. They let it run for 5 minutes, flushed the lines, and watched the tank slowly begin to refill. The relief didn't last. At exactly 3:47 a.m., they were jolted awake by the high-pitched squeal of metal. Bryce was out of bed in seconds, throwing on boots and grabbing the heavy flashlight by the door. Avery followed, armed with the small revolver they kept locked in the nightstand. Outside, the wind was still, but the noise was unmistakable. A screech, followed by a dull metallic thump. They followed the sound toward the shed and stopped short. The gate to the pump area had been torn off its hinges and lay twisted on the ground. The temporary piping Bryce had installed had been wrenched free and flung several yards into the brush. Water hissed from the broken seal, spraying mud in all directions. There were boot prints, deep, erratic, suggesting more than one person had been there, and recently. Bryce wanted to chase after them, but there was no point. The desert swallowed sound and shadow quickly, and without dogs or drones, the trespassers were long gone. Avery stood next to the broken piping in disbelief, breathing hard but saying nothing. She didn't need to. The message had been delivered. They spent the next 2 days in silent coordination. Avery arranged for a third-party inspector from out of county, someone not connected to the regional boards. Bryce reinforced the perimeter with motion sensors, buried, wired, discreet, and posted updated signage citing state trespass law with exact statute numbers. They filed a police report, knowing it wouldn't lead to anything but determined to establish a paper trail. The deputy who took their statement seemed sympathetic, but his tone betrayed a quiet resignation. "There's not much we can do without footage," he said, "and even then, it's your word against theirs unless they're caught in the act." That same afternoon, the white golf cart returned. Capps didn't even get out this time. He parked just outside the gate and waited, sunglasses hiding whatever expression he might have worn. Bryce didn't go out to greet him. He just stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching, letting the silence stretch like a wire pulled taut. After 5 minutes, Capps drove away. But they weren't alone. That evening, their neighbor Maria stopped by, uncharacteristically flustered. She held her phone in one hand, shaking slightly. "They came to me too," she said. "2 men in vests, said they were conducting water surveys. Asked if I'd noticed any changes in my pressure, if I knew where my runoff drained. They were polite but pushy. It didn't feel right." Avery asked if she got their names or any ID. "They showed me badges," Maria replied, "but not state ones. Some private seal like an emblem. I didn't catch it. I told them I didn't want them on my property and they left, but they were taking photos before they drove off." That was enough for Bryce. He called Stinson again, demanded escalation. The lawyer agreed and filed an emergency injunction request to halt all activity related to infrastructure interference on their land. The motion would take time to be reviewed, but it added another layer of formal resistance. In the meantime, Avery made a call to a hydrologist she'd met at a desert sustainability workshop 6 months prior, a quiet but brilliant woman named Dr. Clara Mendez, who had previously worked on aquifer mapping for the Bureau of Land Management before leaving to consult privately. Mendez agreed to visit the site within the week. When she arrived, she wasted no time. She brought equipment, charts, and a quiet focus that filled the space between words. Within an hour, she confirmed what the Westons had feared. The damage to their system had not just been physical, it had disrupted the natural filtration pattern of the well shaft. The chemical samples showed traces of industrial sediment and a high concentration of calcium oxide, consistent with waterline contamination. Someone had deliberately introduced agents to destabilize the system. Mendez prepared a report and submitted it to both the Westons and Stinson. She also noted something else. Nearby terrain had been recently surveyed using equipment usually reserved for subsurface mapping, ground-penetrating radar, the kind used by engineers and land developers. There were no permits filed for such activity in their region. Someone was preparing to map and acquire the area under false pretenses. The implications were sobering. Their well wasn't just an inconvenience to local control, it was standing in the way of a larger, coordinated land acquisition. Whoever was behind this wasn't just harassing them for fun. They had an objective, and the Westons' refusal to submit was interfering with it. That night, Bryce sat outside, staring at the well cover like it was a battlefield monument. Avery joined him, bringing 2 mugs of coffee, neither of which they drank. The wind stirred faintly across the mesa, rustling the dry grass. They didn't speak for several minutes until Bryce finally said, "If we fix it again, they'll just break it." "I know," Avery replied, "and the law won't stop them in time." "I know that too." Bryce leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So what do we do?" Avery didn't answer immediately. She looked out toward the darkness where the shape of the hills folded into shadow, where no one could see what was done or undone. "We stop playing defense," she said at last, "and we make sure that whatever move they try next, it costs them more than it costs us." In that moment, neither of them smiled. They weren't vindictive, but they were resolved. The first escalation had come. The next would be theirs. 3 days after Dr. Mendez submitted her report, Avery received an envelope delivered not by post, but placed directly into their mailbox with no return address. It was heavy, thicker than any letter should have been, and wrapped in weather-resistant plastic. Bryce opened it on the kitchen table, careful not to touch anything inside until they documented it. Inside was a folded topographic map, hand-marked with red circles that highlighted their well, the surrounding land parcels, and several areas shaded in gray beyond their property lines. No words, no notes, no legend. Just a map, dated 6 weeks prior, with surveyor's grid coordinates and initials at the bottom. DRC. It wasn't just a threat or an intimidation tactic, it was a blueprint, and they were in the center of it. Stinson, upon seeing the map, confirmed their suspicion. "This isn't internal planning," he said. "This is acquisition documentation. Someone's preparing to buy or seize these parcels under eminent domain or fabricated compliance violations. If they control the water rights, the land becomes 10 times more valuable." He paused, tapping one of the gray zones. "And they already bought here, here, and here. These aren't random attacks. You're the only ones not playing along." Avery felt the chill of realization settle into her spine. It wasn't about the well. It was about resistance. The oversight group, or whatever shell operation it was hiding behind, had likely strong-armed others into selling or disabling their infrastructure. Anyone who remained had either cooperated or been pushed out through litigation, surveillance, or exhaustion. Bryce, silent beside her, absorbed every word without blinking. He understood the terrain better than most, not the land, but the battlefield. This wasn't a legal dispute, it was psychological attrition. Dr. Mendez, who had returned to collect more samples, offered another piece of the puzzle. While recalibrating her seismic gear on the far edge of their property, she picked up irregularities beneath the surface, metallic echoes inconsistent with natural formations. Someone had buried something roughly 60 yards past the ridge, close to their water runoff channel. She marked the coordinates, and Bryce hiked out that afternoon with a handheld detector. What he found, buried under less than a foot of packed earth, was a steel pipe segment rigged with a simple flow disruptor valve, an illegal bypass device the kind used in unauthorized irrigation systems. It had been capped and disabled, but its presence confirmed that someone was not just mapping their land. They had physically altered it. That night, Avery and Bryce sat down and laid everything out. Photos, Mendez's data, the map, the valve. They constructed a timeline, marked when each event had occurred, matched it to sightings of Capps or his so-called patrol, and began to see the pattern. Every interference had followed one of two things: a successful repair or an official filing. The more they tried to legalize and secure their system, the more aggressively someone tried to destabilize it. It wasn't just surveillance, it was escalation in response to resistance. Rather than react with rage or confrontation, Avery proposed a different route. They would not just defend, they would expose. But not in a courtroom, not in some media stunt that could backfire or be dismissed as paranoia. No, their plan would be quiet, deliberate, and structured. It began with Dr. Mendez filing her environmental report with two separate state agencies, not as a complaint but as a formal declaration of compromised aquifer stability due to unsanctioned development activity. Then, with Stinson's help, they filed a motion to request protective injunction against further utility interference, backed by environmental evidence. Meanwhile, Bryce worked to restore partial flow using old irrigation techniques. Non-mechanical, gravity-fed, low-profile. It wasn't modern, but it kept them running, and, more importantly, it attracted no immediate attention. The turning point came unexpectedly, and not from a legal notice or nighttime sabotage, but from a phone call. The local real estate office rang to ask whether they were still open to selling the parcel, as there had been renewed interest from a buyer who wanted to develop sustainable eco-lodges on historic land. Bryce asked the name of the buyer. The receptionist hesitated, then gave him an LLC title, Mesa Horizon Group. Avery ran a search. The company was a front, registered in Delaware, but linked through shell corporations to a holding firm whose board included, among others, a Daniel Capps. So now it was clear. Capps wasn't just a control-hungry enforcer, he had a stake in the game. All the threats, the sabotage, the pseudo-legal notices, they were aimed at driving them into a corner, one where selling seemed like the only rational option. But Capps had overplayed his hand. Bryce didn't call the real estate office back. Instead, he marked the location of the eco-lodge proposal on the same map that had been left in their mailbox. It fell right over their well, which, if disabled or abandoned, would leave the property legally exposed to resource reclamation under Water Infrastructure Clause 18's. ENF, an old zoning technicality no one paid attention to unless they were looking to exploit it. The next morning, Bryce and Avery prepared their move. They filed an amendment to their water permit, changing its designation from residential to agricultural. It was a subtle but critical difference, one that granted additional protections and changed the jurisdiction of oversight from the county to the state agricultural board. While it would increase the scrutiny of their water usage, it also shielded them from local seizure attempts, especially under contested development claims. Then they did something unexpected. They contacted Maria and the beekeeping couple down the road and offered to extend limited water access through shared pipeline contingencies, complete with written agreements and resource audits. It wasn't charity. It was coalition building. By creating shared dependence on their system, they turned the well from a private resource into a micro-infrastructure hub, one that served multiple properties. Legally, this altered its classification again, increasing protection under public utility easement standards. When Capps returned that week with another notice taped to a clipboard, Bryce met him at the gate. Not with a shotgun, not with shouting, but with a notarized copy of the Cooperative Utility Agreement, signed by 3 other landowners and filed with the registrar's office. Capps looked at the document like it was poison. "This complicates things," he muttered. "No," Bryce replied. "It clarifies them." Capps left without a word. Inside the house, Avery didn't celebrate. She simply returned to her notes, to the record she'd been keeping meticulously for months. "We didn't stop them," she said. "We just slowed them down." Bryce nodded. "Long enough to build leverage. Long enough to make it cost more than it's worth." The middle of the battle had shifted. Not toward resolution, but toward positioning. And the Westons were no longer on defense. It began again with sound. Not the whine of metal or the hiss of ruptured pipes, but something softer, more deliberate, the low hum of diesel engines approaching in the pre-dawn darkness. Bryce had already been awake, sitting near the window with a thermal mug of black coffee, his senses long since tuned to unnatural disturbances in the quiet rhythm of their land. The motion sensors hadn't tripped, and no alarms had sounded, which meant whoever was coming knew exactly how to avoid detection. At 4:27 a.m., a convoy of 3 unmarked trucks rolled slowly past the outer ridge, headlights dimmed to half lumens, tires cushioned for noise reduction. Bryce leaned forward slightly, watching through a slit in the curtain, his fingers tightening around the mug. The vehicles stopped near the north fence line where the soil sloped gently toward the runoff trench, a vulnerable section of their terrain, if one knew how the water system worked. From the shadowed interior of one of the trucks emerged 4 figures wearing tan work coveralls and headlamps, moving quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. This wasn't vandalism. It was an operation. Avery was already pulling on boots when Bryce told her what he saw. She didn't panic, didn't ask useless questions. She handed him the walkie, checked the charge on the solar camera grid, and unlatched the weapons locker. They didn't plan to confront. Not yet. Confrontation required evidence, and evidence required patience. Instead, they watched. The figures unloaded equipment. Not sabotage tools, but survey instruments, collapsible barricades, and what looked like a compact drilling rig. One of them planted a series of flagged stakes in a semicircular pattern along the lower grade, exactly where their drainage channel diverted overflow during monsoon season. The implication was clear. They were preparing to establish a claim, temporary or not, that this land segment was undergoing official review. Bryce scanned the tree line with binoculars. There were no markings on the trucks, no government insignia, no state logos, just a laminated ID badge clipped to one man's vest that read, Regional Safety Consultant, Mesa Project. Avery took pictures. Every few seconds, she snapped and cataloged, zooming in on hands, tools, postures, anything that might later identify the men. They weren't amateurs. Each moved with synchronized purpose, clearly rehearsed. At one point, one of them pulled out a tablet and appeared to cross-reference coordinates. This wasn't surveillance. It was execution. A few hours later, as dawn finally broke, they packed up and left, taking everything with them except the stakes, which now marked a ghost worksite directly atop Weston property. That afternoon, an official document was delivered by private courier. Not a court officer or sheriff's deputy, a contractor. The document was a Notice of Cooperative Field Adjustment, asserting that temporary assessment of adjacent land parcels had begun, and that certain public works may incidentally traverse secondary terrain. The phrasing was slippery, like oil on glass. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. But beneath the layers of technical ambiguity was a threat. Their land was being redefined in real time, and unless they fought back at the same bureaucratic level, it would be absorbed under the guise of shared infrastructure necessity. Stinson filed a countermeasure immediately. His team drafted a cease order citing improper jurisdictional overreach and encroachment without notice or consent. But he also gave them a warning. "This isn't going to end with paper," he said during a tense call. "They've escalated. You should prepare for something physical." The warning came too late. 2 nights later, Bryce awoke to a deep, vibrating clang that echoed through the ground like a distant impact. He grabbed the flashlight and rifle, threw on jeans and a jacket, and sprinted toward the well. What he found was worse than sabotage. It was desecration. The casing around the pump head had been split open by a mechanical wedge, crushed from the top like a tin can. Hydraulic clamps had been used. He could see the indents where the metal was forced inward. The electronics were mangled beyond repair. Whoever did it had time, power tools, and a mandate. Avery, flashlight in hand, scanned the area while Bryce checked the bypass pipe. Water still flowed weakly, but the pressure system was ruined. They called the sheriff's office, filed a second criminal complaint. This time, the deputy arrived the next morning and took the report more seriously. He asked questions, walked the perimeter, and photographed the damage. But without direct footage or identifiable suspects, the law remained inert. They had evidence of destruction, but no names, no prints, no plate numbers. The deputy's frustration was visible. "This wasn't random," he muttered, "but proving it's another story." The next 24 hours were critical. Avery contacted Dr. Mendez again, requesting an emergency inspection. Mendez arrived with 2 associates and began testing not just the system, but the surrounding soil and water table for foreign agents. The results were damning. There were new contaminants, fine traces of antifreeze compounds, industrial lubricant, and microplastic particulates, all consistent with deliberate interference. She wrote a second report, more severe in tone, and copied it to the State Environmental Board, bypassing local authorities. Meanwhile, Bryce took a different route. With help from a neighbor, Tom, the old welder who lived 3 properties down, he borrowed a portable pump, rerouted the backup line, and began manually filtering water through sediment basins. It was crude but effective. Tom said little, but when he left, he handed Bryce a sealed envelope. Inside was a single photograph. One of the workmen who had been at the site 3 nights earlier, standing near a red truck with visible license plates. Tom had snapped it from his back porch. That night, Bryce and Avery reviewed their footage from the motion cameras. With the photo as a reference point, they confirmed the man's identity. He had been on their property at least twice. The escalation wasn't over. The following weekend, a massive white banner appeared on the far side of their northern boundary, strung between 2 posts that hadn't existed the day before. The banner read, "Proposed Site, Community Water Reclamation Hub, Under Development." Beneath it was a QR code linking to a web page outlining a fictional initiative from a group called Clean Horizon Collective. The initiative promised ecological sustainability, community reinvestment, and adaptive land use. Integration. It was propaganda, but dangerous propaganda. If left unchallenged, it created the impression that the land was no longer theirs, but part of a larger, nobler mission. Public sentiment could shift. Bryce took the banner down, burned it in a controlled pit, and filed another notice with the registrar to formally denounce any association with the so-called collective. But they couldn't stay on defense forever. That night, while checking the runoff control trench, Bryce noticed that the flow had altered. It was stronger, redirected toward the west fence line. The trench hadn't shifted. Someone had manipulated the slope. He followed the path of the water, flashlight beam bouncing along the carved channels, until he reached the edge of the property. There, partially obscured by brush, was a low-lying culvert pipe, recently installed, aimed downhill toward a clearing just beyond their boundary. And in that clearing, barely visible under tarp, was a familiar structure, Daniel Capp's golf cart garage. The implications hit him all at once. The redirection of water wasn't just to undermine their well or contaminate their land. It was designed to stage an accident. With enough force during a rain or discharge event, the runoff could flood that clearing, damage the structure, and frame the Westons for negligence or retaliation. Bryce returned home and drew up a plan. If they were going to be blamed, they would at least be prepared. Over the next 48 hours, he and Avery worked in quiet synchrony. They adjusted the trenches, reinforced the culvert boundaries with concrete, and installed drainage overflow gates with locking mechanisms. They logged everything, time-stamped photos, created a geotagged map, and prepared notarized documentation of each alteration. Then Bryce built a release system, a manual flood valve, pressure-based, designed to activate only when moisture saturation exceeded a safe threshold. It was legal, it was defensive, and it pointed directly away from their property, toward the clearing. That week, the rain finally came, hard, unrelenting, drenching the land in long overdue relief. The drainage system activated as planned. The overflow trench filled quickly, and just before midnight the culvert surged. The redirected floodwaters poured down the slope, bypassed their land, and overwhelmed the lower terrain. The golf cart garage was swallowed in minutes. By morning, it was under 3 feet of water. They received no visit from Capps that day, no accusations, no threats. But word came quietly from Maria 2 days later. He had filed a complaint with the county about unauthorized redirection of surface water, but withdrew it after internal review. It seemed the legal department had reviewed the documents the Westons had filed and determined everything had been done to code. Capps hadn't just lost the advantage, he'd been outmaneuvered with precision. Avery stood at the edge of the ridge that evening, watching the last of the water recede. Her boots were muddy, her hands scraped, but her eyes were sharp. Bryce joined her, silent, offering no commentary. They both understood what had just occurred. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't sabotage, it was consequence, and it had been earned. The calm that followed the flooding of the golf cart garage was deceptive, more like the tension before a storm than the relief after one. Bryce and Avery knew better than to believe it was over. People like Daniel Capps didn't disappear after one tactical setback. They regrouped, recalibrated, and came back twice as vicious. But what neither of them expected was how quickly the response would come, and how quietly it would unfold. There was no shouting, no public confrontation, no vehicles barreling down the dirt road this time. Instead, the retaliation came through paper, dense, legal, suffocating paper. It began with a certified letter from the County Development Authority, citing alleged violations of runoff code and a possible breach of environmental safety standards due to excessive water dispersion during recent storm activity. The letter was formal, heavy with bureaucratic language, and at a glance appeared legitimate. Avery read it 3 times before catching the inconsistencies. The cited statute didn't match the enforcement body. The date of the alleged incident didn't correspond with the rainfall data published by the state. Most damning of all, the satellite images attached to the packet weren't from a county source at all. They were from a private surveillance firm that had no jurisdiction over public environmental assessments. She circled every error and handed the packet to Stinson, who responded within 12 hours by filing a challenge and requesting an immediate formal hearing. He suspected that this wasn't a real enforcement action, but rather a manufactured complaint pushed through a corrupted internal channel. It was designed to appear real just long enough to frighten the Westons into either settling, ceding their land rights, or compromising their infrastructure through forced mitigation. Bryce, meanwhile, returned to the ridge where the culvert had discharged. He examined the slope, recorded moisture levels, and double-checked the stability of the overflow gate. Everything was intact. His design had held under real conditions, and there was no structural damage to his property. What happened beyond the boundary wasn't his responsibility, and, more importantly, every adjustment he made had been logged and filed. He returned that evening to find a second letter, this one hand-delivered and unsigned, pinned to the fence post near the access road. It was brief, typed in capital letters, and devoid of any official formatting. "You think this is done. It's not. The well will dry, the land will crack, and you will be left with nothing." Bryce stood in place for a long moment, reading it twice, then pulled it down, folded it carefully, and stored it with the rest of the documentation. It wasn't the content that bothered him. It was the desperation behind it. The following morning, Avery received a call from Dr. Mendez. Her voice was steady but urgent. She had received word through her contacts at the State Water Bureau that a motion had been quietly filed to reclassify certain parcels under a new regional utility zone, a designation that, if passed, would shift authority of land-based water infrastructure to a central governing body under emergency provisions. The bill was buried deep in a larger package of zoning amendments tied to wildfire relief funding. It wasn't meant to pass under scrutiny. It was meant to pass unnoticed. Mendez offered to send over the full draft, which had yet to be debated publicly. Avery took it straight to Stinson. He went pale as he read the details. If enacted, the amendment would grant the overseeing board full control of all non-municipal water sources within the designated radius, which included the Westons' property. It would effectively nullify their permits, their filings, even their conservation agreements with neighboring owners. Worse, it would not trigger compensation because the land wouldn't be seized. It would merely fall under administrative water asset management, a term that had no legal precedent and could be challenged only through state appellate court. It was a corporate land grab, legalized through procedural camouflage. Stinson immediately contacted a legal coalition known for taking on environmental infrastructure fraud. Their involvement was risky. They operated at a much higher political level, but the urgency of the situation demanded it. The coalition reviewed the case and agreed to draft an injunction if the amendment moved forward. It wasn't a guarantee of protection, but it was a lifeline. That night, the Westons decided to act preemptively. Bryce gathered every document they had: photos, maps, filings, letters, threat notes, soil tests, and scanned them into a digital archive. Avery backed up the archive to 3 separate encrypted drives and handed one to Maria, one to Tom, and locked the third in a waterproof safe hidden inside the barn. Then they began preparing the well for isolation. If they were going to lose access, it wouldn't be because someone physically destroyed it again. Bryce reinforced the shaft casing with steel bracing, welded the access collar shut with a keyed lock plate, and rerouted the intake valves into a subterranean chamber with a decoy shutoff. It was extreme, but necessary. He wasn't just preserving a system. He was protecting a symbol. The storm broke 2 days later. At exactly 5:02 a.m., 2 white SUVs rolled up the ridge, followed by a marked utility truck bearing the Mesa Horizon Group logo. 6 individuals stepped out, all wearing safety vests, none in uniform. The lead agent approached the gate, clipboard in hand, and stated they were there to conduct a site review pursuant to emergency resource stabilization. Bryce met them at the fence, arms crossed. He said nothing. When the man tried to hand over a document, Avery appeared beside him with her phone already recording. She asked what statute authorized their entry. The man began reciting jargon until she interrupted and requested to see a court order. There wasn't one. They left after 7 minutes, visibly irritated, the lead agent saying something about escalation protocol. By noon, a 3rd certified letter arrived, this one demanding immediate inspection under penalty of obstruction. Stinson, already on edge, advised them to prepare for civil enforcement officers, but they never came. Instead, that evening, Bryce received a message through a back channel, encrypted, untraceable, containing 2 photos. The first was of Capps standing beside the damaged garage, ankle-deep in water, gesturing furiously at someone off camera. The second showed a printed map on the dashboard of a truck labeled with coordinates and photos of various properties, including theirs, all marked with dates and access notes. The photos had metadata. They had been taken from inside one of the Mesa Horizon trucks. The implication was clear. Someone inside had turned. Maybe not to help, maybe just to sabotage Cap's position. But the leak was deliberate. That night, Bryce and Avery forwarded everything to Stinson and the coalition, who filed the injunction early the next morning. It hit the board just in time to stall the vote on the amendment. The backlash was immediate. Questions were raised. An internal audit was triggered. Mesa Horizon's development proposal was suspended pending investigation. 2 days later, Daniel Capps officially resigned from his oversight position. No statement, no appearance. Just a press release citing health and personal reasons. The trucks stopped coming. The calls ended. The mailbox stayed empty. Avery sat on the porch that evening, barefoot, watching the wind ripple across the dry hills. Bryce stood behind her, arms folded, silent. They hadn't won in the way people usually understand victory. There were no parades, no payouts, no public apologies, but they were still standing, and the well still flowed. That was enough. They hadn't just defended their land. They had exposed something built on deceit, forced it into the light, and lived through the process. That, in itself, was a reckoning. Bryce poured 2 fingers of whiskey, handed her a glass, and sat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The night was still, vast, indifferent, and yet it felt different now, earned, preserved, fiercely quiet. Then Avery, after a long pause, murmured, "They'll try again, someday." Bryce nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Summer arrived slowly that year, not with the sudden snap of heat that Arizona was known for, but with a deliberate climb in temperature that brought long orange sunsets and the dry scent of mesquite in the air. Bryce and Avery didn't rush to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Normal was a word that no longer held meaning in the same way it had before. Their land, though still scarred from the months of quiet war, had survived. The well continued to deliver water, steady and pure, and the ridgeline remained undisturbed. The silence that returned wasn't the anxious kind, the one that hangs heavy after a threat. It was a silence earned through resistance, and they let it settle like dust into every corner of their lives. The aftermath wasn't clean. The State Environmental Board launched an internal inquiry into the Desert Ridge Oversight Committee, Mesa Horizon Group, and the network of shell companies surrounding them. That inquiry led to resignations beyond Capps. A cluster of real estate acquisitions tied to the project were placed under review, and a development moratorium was imposed on the sector that included the Weston's property. What surprised them most, however, was how few people reached out. There was no parade of apologies, no flood of gratitude from those who had benefited indirectly from their fight. The neighbors they had helped with water access kept their distance, respectful but reserved. It didn't bother Bryce. He never did it for thanks. Avery, for her part, understood it as a kind of social instinct. People were wary of those who stirred the ground, others preferred to walk over quietly. Despite everything, life didn't freeze. It shifted. Avery took a consultancy job for a regional conservation group, advising on water rights protections for independent landowners. She didn't mention the fight directly, but used their experience to help others draft smarter agreements and navigate the tangled bureaucracy that often strangled people who simply wanted to live off their land. Her advice was concise, practical, and carried the quiet authority of someone who had been tested. Bryce turned his attention back to building. Not just repairs, real improvements. He reinforced the fencing along the back perimeter, poured concrete for a second water reserve tank, and designed a pressure-safe overflow gate that redirected runoff into a collection channel they now shared with Maria and Tom. What had begun as a line of defense had become a quiet network of trust. One afternoon in mid-July, they received a letter, not the kind that came with threats or fake credentials, but a handwritten note from a young couple who had recently purchased property a few miles north. They had heard, in vague whispers through the local co-op, about what had happened and wanted advice. Bryce read the letter twice before folding it neatly and placing it on the table. "They're smart to ask," he said. "We should meet them." That weekend, they did. The meeting wasn't formal. It took place under the shade of an old cottonwood tree near the base of the ridge. They brought maps, a thermos of sweet tea, And no speeches. Just a conversation. That's how it began. A slow weaving of old knowledge into new hands, not as saviors or veterans of some invisible war, but as landowners who had learned to survive by being clear-eyed, deliberate, and unafraid of consequence. It was the start of something they hadn't anticipated. A role not just as defenders of their space, but as quiet anchors in a landscape that had started to bend under pressure from things no longer as hidden as they once were. Weeks passed. The sun grew hotter, and the land, as if grateful, responded. The runoff channel filled predictably with the early monsoon trickles. Wild bees returned to the lavender patches Avery had planted during the spring, and even the battered windmill near the barn groaned back to life with an almost amused creak. Bryce laughed when he heard it, a rare sound that came not from triumph, but from the slow realization that something, after all that had happened, had endured. Not just the infrastructure or the permit lines, but the will to stay. They didn't talk about Capps anymore. His name became a fossil in their memory, preserved but inert. Rumors said he moved north, somewhere colder, quieter, far from the dry land that had resisted him. It didn't matter. What mattered was that no one tried to step into his place. The power structure he had leaned on had fractured under scrutiny. Without the artificial authority, there was no longer a mouthpiece for threats dressed as regulation. Those who remained in the surrounding area had seen enough to understand that pushing the Westons wouldn't lead to compliance. It would lead to resistance wrapped in law, in paperwork, in silent allies who knew how to write filings that hit harder than fists. On the 1-year mark of the first notice, Avery stood next to the well, her hand resting lightly on the rim of the new casing Bryce had installed. It wasn't just functional. It was engraved with a line she had etched by hand the night before using a small wood-burning iron. The water remains. It wasn't meant to be poetic. It was literal. Everything around them could shift, could try to bend the narrative, reroute the channels, legislate trust into forfeiture. But the water remained. It was a symbol not just of survival, but of the refusal to surrender what had been earned through hardship, patience, and clarity. They didn't celebrate. There was no need. The well continued to flow. The land, while not at peace, was stable. And the two of them, seated once again on the porch as dusk softened the horizon, understood what had been built, not just in infrastructure or defenses, but in resolve. No signs marked their success. No cameras captured their decision-making. It was not a story made for headlines, but it was the kind of story that lived quietly in the dirt and wind, in the calibrated hum of a functioning pressure valve, in the silence that returned not as fear, but as proof. It was over, for now, and that was enough.